Also, we're continuing in today's Mishna Yomi, and we find ourselves today in Maseches Demai, Perek Beis, Mishnah Hey, and Perek Gimel, Mishnah Aleph, Chapter 2, Mishnah 5, Chapter 3, Mishnah 1. Rabbi Meir says as follows, which literally means if something is normally sold in large measure, but in this case, the seller is selling it in a smaller measure, we treat the produce as produce that is sold in large measure. What is this talking about? Remember again, in the previous Mishnah, we saw that halacha l'maaseh, any time that produce is sold in large quantities, the obligation to take care of demai is upon the purchaser, not upon the seller. And the reason is because since it's being sold in large quantity, the assumption is that the seller is being more generous, and therefore halacha l'maaseh giving extra, and therefore Chazal, the rabbi said, you know what, he doesn't have to deal with demai. Let the purchaser go ahead and deal with it. Masha'en kein, whereas if you have produce that is normally sold in smaller quantity, then halacha l'maaseh, again in that case, we assume the seller is making more money, and we say, okay, you take care of demai. The purchaser does not have to take care of demai. So Rabbi Meir goes ahead and deals with the following situation. What happens? You have produce that you normally sell in large quantity, but in this case, you're selling it in smaller quantity. What's talacha? Tfela daka lagasa. Literally, the small measure is batal to the larger measure. Negated to, what does this mean? Essentially, we look at the way produce is normally sold, and we don't focus on how you're actually selling it. So, for example, you're selling produce that is normally sold in large measure, but you happen to be selling it in small measure. We look at it as a large measure transaction and not as a small measure transaction. Remember, again, the nafkamina, the practical difference is who's going to have to take care of demai. If it's produce, if it's a large measure transaction, the obligation to remedy demai is upon the purchaser. If it's a small measure transaction, the obligation to take care of demai is on the seller. So what Rabbi Meir is teaching us similarly again, if you have something that's normally sold in small measure, but now you're selling it in large measure, tfela gasa lidaka. So again, the idea being is we look at the way the produce is normally sold, not necessarily as to the way you're selling it. And therefore the obligation to take care of demai is predicated or really based on how produce is normally sold. And if your transaction is a bit of an aberration, the demai obligation rests upon the party, again, as if we were looking at this as an objective transaction. Ezuhi midagas, so what's considered to be a large measure? Biyavish shloshes kabin. For dry foods, it's 3 kav. Ubalach b'dinar. And for liquids, it's the amount of liquid that could be purchased for a dinar. So the Mishnah goes on. The Mishnah says, Rabbi Yossi Omer, Sali te'inim v'sali anavim v'kupo shel yarak. If you have baskets of figs, baskets of grapes, or baskets of vegetables, calls manshu mochran, ach sura potter. So interestingly enough, as long as you're selling them by estimation. So the idea is, anytime you're going in and selling by estimation so you're not weighing it, you're not measuring it, then halacha l'maaseh, that's considered to be a large, we'll call it a large scale transaction, and therefore halacha l'maaseh, the seller won't be obligated to deal with demai. Only the purchaser will be obligated to do so. Incredible. Mazel tov, finishing Perek Beis, we now begin Perek Gimel. Ma'achilinas ha'aniyim demai. So an interesting halacha, there are certain people who Chazal said we relax the standards of demai and allow them to go ahead and consume demai. So for example, you can give demai to the poor. Remember again, demai on a biblical level is totally permitted. The rabbis were machmir. So essentially the rabbis suspended their chumras in situations of need. So to feed the poor, they suspended the chumrah. That's achsanya demai. Achsanya are soldiers who are stationed in a city. You can also give them demai. Rabbi Gamliel hayam achilas paul of demai. Rabbi Gamliel would give his workers. The Bartanura says, aniyim heim. They were poor. He would give his poor workers demai. Gabbai tzedakah. Now this is an interesting case. When the gabbai tzedakah is the person who goes ahead and collects tzedakah. But in this case, he's collecting food for tzedakah. Beishamai omrim, no snines hamo usr l'she'enu ma'aser, ves she'enu ma'usr l'ma'aser. We give tithed food to people who are not normally careful to tithe, and we give untithed food to people who are careful to tithe. Nimtza kol adam ochlin misukan. This way, everybody eats tithed food. So it's interesting. So according to in this idea, Beis Shammai says that essentially, when collecting food, the Gabbai Tzedakah knows certain food is tithed, certain food is not tithed. See, he says we give the untithed food to the people who are careful to tithe because we know they'll take care of the food, they'll properly tithe it. We give tithed food to people who aren't careful with Trumas and Maasros, because this way we know they're not careful, and this way we know that at least they're going to end up eating properly tithed food. The Chacham say no, Govin stam umechalkin stam. No, Chacham say we don't do this. First of all, because this would be too onerous of a process upon the Gabbai Tzedakah. Therefore, we collect food from whoever, and what happens? Umechalkin stam varotz letakin yitakin. So what it sounds like is we collect, we just dispense. And if you want to take tithes, you take tithes. Now the Bartanura says it's not optional. What the Chachamim are saying is we don't put it upon the Gabbai Tzedakah to figure out, who tied their food, who didn't tie their food, who should we give what to. The Gabbai Tzedakah's job is to collect food for Tzedakah. After he does that, he dispenses it, and we tell the Aniyim, we tell the poor, you are obligated to separate out your own Trumas and Maasros. Essentially, we treat the Tzedakah as if it is untithed, and therefore the obligation to tithe falls upon the Aniyim. Wonderful. We'll stop over here for today. Wishing everyone a wonderful day.